Misty Valley Cooperative presents Dim and Flaring Lamps. The paths of the world twist and turn. They divide and converge, taking you to unexpected places. They link our Midland world to the overland and to the land of the dead beneath us. In those dark streets, lamps are glimmering, and each lamp tells a tale. A story may become a dream, and dreams on occasion may come true. But beware, some dreams are nightmares. The Forked Ways. Part 3. Dim and Flaring Lamps. By Beau Farr. Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Robert Louis Stevenson. Epitaph. 1. The Lamplighter. "Tell me a story," Fletch said. Silver put down his book. "What kind of story? How about Faulkner?" "Not read. Tell. A fairy tale." Silver sighed. "You always want fairy tales." "They're the most true," Fletch insisted. "I can't argue with that," Silver relented. "What time of day?" "Night," said Fletch, snuggling closer. "And out of doors, in the cold." Silver closed his eyes, waiting for the mental pictures to emerge. "This is the last night," he began softly, "when fields are silver under the moon. A shuttered lantern gleams, dodges along the forest path. Deep leaves rustle, brittle with cold. The trees are crows, stretched like claws upon the hills, darker than the evening sky." Fletch relaxed, enraptured by the spell of Silver's words. "The glade is pale. In the well beside the tall house there are ghosts, and down there morning never goes. Beneath the porch a rat sleeps, its whiskers barely visible through the grating. Rain runs down the mossy walls, rings out from the drain-pipe warning words. Down in the depths of the well's ruins, one old man lights lamps to pierce the night." Silver paused for a few moments, gathering his thoughts as the images took form. Near the front door, a tall cat sits quietly in the cold air. Among the straw, the rat stirs. Early sunlight touches the metal grid with warm fingers. The night and rain have passed. The man looks up toward the lamp, and beyond it to a round window high above. A mile of dust and cobwebs separates him from the light. Heaven sheds a solemn thought into the lands of growing heat, singing quiet laughter. It moves through tangled brush. A shadow skirts the edge of the field, and the cold returns. The day wears old in wrinkled sleeves, limping fitfully down the trail, observed by attic windows. All the wood grows still. Coins of light upon the damp leaves slip down and out of sight. Bear-like and fawn-like the shadow moves on. No one in the tall house moves, and nothing stirs. No window lifts to hear the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden. Lulled by the sound of Silver's voice, Fletch listened and dreamed. The Dietz lantern squeaked and rattled as the old man climbed from the top of the tall rock and made his way along the uneven slope. "Wind and fire," he thought, and still there came a frost. It lay on the moonlit forest, holding the hillside in stillness and silence. A breathless sigh hovered in the air, trembling among the ice-shelled twigs. Crowther Wills moved along the path, taking care to keep his footing, but welcoming the trouble it took. For far too long he had been unable to stand or walk without assistance. The girl who had set him free had demanded a high price for his liberation, and the last thing Crowther had seen through mortal eyes had been the delight flaming in her own eyes as she had taken her toll. The lantern he carried was an ordinary one, scarred and dented from long use, half filled with kerosene. Crowther's intended work lay in the town beyond the valley, and the lamps along those distant streets stood in darkness, awaiting his arrival. The underland mirrored the midland, but with notable differences. Here below, in burrows, caves, and stony lairs along the path, the dead slept, some peacefully, others restless with troubling dreams. Crowther did not disturb them, or if he did, it was only through the influence of his passing, the whisper of a fragile ghost who had once been a powerful human being. He had taken on the business of waking the dead, but his methods were bound by custom and tradition. Yellow lights glimmered from the stone house across the valley, filtering through the winter branches. Crowther stopped to look at them, wondering if they were real. His memory sometimes tricked him. A curve in the path might resemble a place he had known in childhood, but lead to a place entirely strange. He hadn't owned the tall house called Patmos, built on the side of the hill, only worked there for a while as an overseer, but much had happened there. He reached the stream at a secluded spot where the ice-cold water rushed over the roots of an old yew tree and tumbled into a pool. He dipped his hand into the water, relishing the pain, then bent to drink. Elsewhere the water was often brackish, tainted by the Mulberry and Yargo estuaries. But here, in the hills around Assembly, anyone who wished might drink their fill, provided they could stand the cold. A heap of snow on the far bank concealed a stack of poles he had recently cut from the yew, and Crowther waded over. He kicked the snow away and chose a long, thin rod with a suitable curve at the end. He hefted it, lifted it high, judging its weight and length. Drawing a knife from his boot, he stripped away the bark. Finally, he held the staff at arm's length and studied it again. It would do. Strong, but not cumbersome, suitable for carrying a long way. He climbed the bank beyond the stream, crossed a barbed wire fence, and dropped onto the railroad tracks, running parallel to the asphalt road which led to Winder. In this part of the country there was little chance of hitching a ride so late, but the town wasn't far, only a few miles beyond the next hill. A black wagon with a broken axle lay abandoned in the ditch, and Crowther moved toward it, lifting his lantern. The long, narrow crates in the back gaped open and empty. Anything of interest had already been looted, or had shambled away. Crowther shook the yew-pole at the derelict wagon, recalling an old verse. I sing of maypoles, hock carts, wassails, wakes. I sing of time's trans-shifting. Free of the frost-bound wood, he extinguished the lantern. The words set him on the way to Winder, and he met no one along the way. In the dimness, he could make out the shapes of abandoned dredging machines, stalled in the flooded winter fields, where in warmer weather he had seen onions, beans, and potatoes planted. But after a few miles, the countryside yielded to weed-grown asphalt lots and straggling lines of buildings, their shattered windows secured behind metal grills. "Bail bonds, guns and ammo, we buy gold." The shop he wanted looked deserted, but Crowther knew the place and had conducted occasional business there. He approached through heaps of wind-blown refuse and rattled one of the grills. After a long moment, a face appeared behind a broken pane. "Who are you? A sluicer? What do you want?" "Lamplighter," said Crowther. "I want the sharp-dressed men." "I haven't seen them," the voice insisted. The face turned left, then right. A gleam flashed from an eye. "Crowther Wills?" "Open up, May. You got a fire going in there?" The face disappeared. A clank and clash of metal came from behind a nearby door. The door screeched, and the grate rattled up. Crowther entered the unlit room and made his way toward an orange glimmer of coals burning in an iron stove. The woman peered at him. She was tall, her bearing regal. "I didn't recognize you. You're so old, I took you for one of the dead." Crowther warmed his hands. "You'd be right. Happens to all of us, eventually." He found a mug and poured coffee from a tin pot at the back of the stove. "Were you asleep or sitting in the dark?" "The electricity's out. I've been careful with the kerosene, but we're running low." May raised an eyebrow. Her mouth flickered into a half-smile. "So you've died at last, after all this time. I wouldn't have thought it possible. Are you hungry?" Crowther eyed the black pot and pan on the stove. "I could eat a bite. What are you cooking?" "Turnip greens and cornbread." Crowther drew an aluminum chair to the corner table. "All the fields to the south and east are flooded," he informed her. "They'll be frozen before long. Do you have supplies to last the winter?" May spooned the greens onto a tin plate and used an old combat knife to carve out a piece of cornbread. "There's always enough, and a bit to spare. Nobody starves down here." She looked at the dented lantern Crowther had brought in, and the long wooden pole. "Fuel is another matter." Her luminous eyes darkened. "I suppose we'll be all right, unless the dikes give way." Crowther took the plate and sipped his coffee, nodding his appreciation. "You always did see the bright side of things. I need a hook and taper for the rod." "The men will have it, or they can make one," she told him. "They're wrecking the church on Broad Street." Crowther looked at her. "All three of them? Together?" "Last I heard, anyway," she said with a shrug. "They come and go, circling like scavengers. For a while they had a forge at the mine shaft. Maybe a still. I don't know. I tried to avoid them." Crowther's lips thinned. "That's wise. You know Frank. He loses his head." May smiled, but she cast a nervous glance at the door. "You can joke like that. You're not afraid of them." "I reckon I grew out of it," he said, picking up his lantern. "I've outlived them all. They're friendly enough if you don't cross them. Can you spare the kerosene? And the men will want gifts." "I can spare enough for one night, no more." She disappeared into the darkness at the back of the shop and returned with a funnel and a metal can. It sounded almost empty, but she filled his lantern. "I'm fresh out of gifts, but I have something in the back I'll trade you. Something they'll like." "I'm poor, May. I don't have 3 coins to my name." "I said trade." Crowther gave her a suspicious look. "Trade for what?" "A delivery, and you'd better not let those 3 charmers sniff it out. Come into the back and I'll show you." She led him behind the counter and down a short corridor, then unlocked a door and motioned him into a back room. She indicated a dark corner occupied by a bassinet draped with a black cloth. The thing within stirred as it detected her presence, emitting a low, fluttering hum. "What's that you have there, May?" Claws clattered against the side of the bassinet. The hum grew louder, and sparks flashed and snapped beneath the cloth, bringing an odor of ozone. "That's no sound of a Midland child," said Crowther. He lifted the covering and peered beneath it. "I've never seen its like. Does it cry?" "Oh, it cries. You've never heard such cries. I fetched it from the hollow of a grave." May removed one of her eyes and directed the beam to a hidden photocell. A panel slid open, revealing the interior of a tiny cupboard, containing a small cloisonné box, the copper enameled with an intricate pattern of flowers. Beside it rested a single pale pink rose, densely petaled. "It's the box you'll want," she said. "Go ahead, open it." Crowther lifted the lid with caution, and radiance spilled from the box. May averted her eye, and as the glow dimmed, Crowther realized that the box was filled with flecks of gold, almost as fine as sand. "I'm impressed," he admitted. "How did you come by it?" "From the Artisans' Assembly. A convent in France had it before the war." May pushed him away, took the box, and wrapped it tightly in brown paper, tying it with twine. She folded a scrap of canvas around it, then stuffed the bundle into a battered military knapsack. "Take it," she said to Crowther. "They'll recognize it, or at least one of them will." "That's no gift," said Crowther. "That's a fortune." "Or a curse," May said. "I've kept it 15 years. It's time I passed it on." Crowther took the pack and glanced back at the cupboard. In the dimness, the color of the rose had paled from pink to silver. "Take the gold to the sharp-dressed men," May told him. "They'll give you anything you ask. By the time you've done your rounds, the child will be ready to go." "Where do you want me to take it?" "To the world's end. The boys will keep her safe." "It's a girl, then?" "It appears so, for the moment." She followed him to the front room and opened the door to the street. For a moment she looked up, as if searching for patterns among the stars in the winter sky. "People have seen blazes," she told him quietly, "streaks of fire carried on the wind." "Smokestack lightning," Crowther said, dismissing it. "The Gainesville Midland burning coal." "It's more than that, I'm sure," said May, murmuring more to herself than to Crowther. "1, then 2, then 3. A dance of 3, though I can't imagine how they get along." She withdrew into the shadows, turning to the dim corridor leading to the back room. Little claw hand so far from home, hillside harnessed bound to roam. Crowther watched as she receded. He had never understood her, and sometimes he had feared her, though they had never quarreled, save for once, long ago, when he had slain her son. He reached up to tip his hat, found it missing, and resumed his journey toward the center of town. The buildings he passed appeared vacant, and many of them were in ruins, little more than heaps of brick or twisted aluminum overgrown with grass and briars. No vehicles moved along the remains of the highway, and he encountered no pedestrians. Few people in Winder ventured into the wild lands beyond the tracks, and the road was in such poor repair that it had begun to crumble. Those strays and vagabonds might be glimpsed in these waste places, Sensible people kept to their hutches and hovels in town. They were cautious, and light seldom leaked from their blackened windows. He came to an intersection where a sunken street rose from beneath a railroad bridge. Above him, a train approached from town, bound for the Midland. The monstrosity clattered overhead, the engine huge, black, and thundering, filling the air with smoke and steam. Red light flashed from the windows of the passenger cars trailing out behind. Crowther looked up and swept his arm above his head in a broad, derisive greeting. "Lo, the apostolic train!" he shouted, but his hailing of the engine was drowned in the calamity of its passing. He crossed beneath the tracks and emerged between weed-grown hills, topped with wooden posts and wire. Few houses remained along the street beyond, but he spied occasional glimmers of flame in the brick-lined pits of cellar-holes at the sites of vanished homes. Beyond Sage Street, tall ruins of brick and stone reared up against the paling sky. The jail and the Christian church, the courthouse, hotel, and bottling works, their shattered windows like blind eyes. A few people were beginning to gather near the sprawl of the farmer's warehouse and at the depot on Broad Street. Crowther avoided them, continuing north and crossing another set of tracks, and turning right at the next corner. A block ahead, the broken towers of the First Baptist Church stood like sentinels. The building had occupied the lot for more than a century, and its location had long been a spiritual hub for the town which surrounded it. Crowther recalled the shimmering sound of the chimes, ringing out the solemn evening hymns to close the working day. Now the structure was half gone. A tall crane stood among the rubble, a massive wrecking ball hanging from the sheave at the point of the boom. Crowther crossed the street and ascended the steps to the sagging doors. He took a moment to collect his powers, then raised the rod he had cut from the yew tree. With the tip of the rod he marked a pattern of numerals and letters above the door, the year, as best as he could guess it, and the initials of the 3 devils he wished to summon. The marks blazed with dark red fire as he called the names: Carfax, Moloch, Belial. Smoke began to slither from the gaps around the doors. It oozed through the keyholes. The bent hinges groaned and rattled. The doors shook as they opened, and instinctively Crowther stepped back into the street as the sharp-dressed men emerged. They drew together on the church steps and sat down, the tallest in the middle. All 3 wore black suits, starched shirts, and elegant ties. Their hats would have been at the height of fashion in 1910, and their black shoes gleamed like volcanic glass. The man on the left rested his arms on his knees and began to fill his pipe. He gave Crowther a doleful look. "Well, if it isn't Benjamin's wolf, gone old and gray." Crowther ignored the slight, offering the man a nod. "I've missed you, Sam. How goes the night?" Samuel Heller tamped his pipe and lit it, flicking the match into the street. "It is far spent," he replied, and even as he spoke, the dawn glow of his dying match spread along the pavement and climbed the ruined walls. Frank Wills, the tallest and most handsome of the 3 men, stood and greeted his son. He opened the document he had brought and handed it to Crowther for inspection. 4,000 winters, signed, sealed, and delivered, he said. "I'm disappointed in you, boy. I never took you for a traitor to the cause." Crowther shrugged. "I was never a man for a cause," he told his father. "I do what I will." "That was always the trouble with you," the third man spoke up. "No sense of duty." Barnabas Y. had the merriest face of the three, his smile like that of a cherub in a bad painting. He stood and offered Crowther his hand. "Anyway, it's good to see you." Crowther's eyes traveled over the metal barrels and heaps of debris the men had dragged from the ruins of the building. "Salvage anything interesting?" "Rags and old iron, mostly," said Frank. "But look at this." He lifted a canvas tarp. "There's some decent lead around that stained glass." "I remember this," said Crowther, stooping to inspect the shattered window. "It was in the wall above the doors. Jesus had 6 toes, as I recall." He glanced up, scanning the remains of the church's facade. "It reminds me of Manchester during the war, that church on Thursday Street. What do you plan on putting here once it's all cleared away?" "I don't much care," said Frank. "The main thing is knocking it down. You should see that wrecking ball when it comes swinging in. Pickett's charge, they call it. Boom! I'm telling you, it does my heart good." Sam came over and scuffed at the rubble with the toe of his shoe. "What are you looking for in particular?" Crowther showed him the yew-rod. "A hook and taper," he said, "for them that lie forlorn." As the man regarded him, the perpetual gloom in his eyes deepened with resentment. "So you're determined to light the lamps. No good will come of that." "That's not my affair," Crowther told him. "I just deal with the WPA. Work's progress? It's a communist plot," Sam muttered. "The Overlanders are behind it. Oh, yes, I've got their names. Negroes and Jews. I'm sure they'll be glad to have you." "I never knew you to discriminate," Crowther told him. "As I recall, you'd kill most anybody." "Oh, yes," Sam agreed. "I made good use of my Midland days. It's hard to kill anyone down here, seeing as how they're dead already." Frank looked at Crowther speculatively. "Unless I'm mistaken, you've brought something with you. Something rare and fine." Crowther slipped the knapsack from his shoulder and unbuckled the straps. "Finer than anything you've seen in a long time." He unwrapped the cloisonné box and set it before the men. They drew near to it, their movements fluid and silky, but cautious. Crowther knew they were noting every aspect of the box, its design and workmanship, its possible age and place of origin. "Open it," Frank instructed Barnabas. The man's cheerful face lost its color. He appeared to be weighing the cost of refusal, but at a flash from the tall man's eyes, he quickly bent and lifted the lid. Golden light leapt from the box, and he and Sam stepped back. Only Frank came forward, stooped down, and took the box in his hands. "Darkness, fire, and chains," he exclaimed softly. "This is Egyptian gold, and rare indeed, sifted from the sand of the plains of Sinai." He lifted his head, looking across the street and beyond the roofs of the town into the bright glare of the morning. Crowther saw endless miles in his father's eyes, and impossible age, though the man appeared many years younger than Crowther himself. Frank closed the lid of the box and turned to his son with a nod. "I'll accept this gift, and the riddle of how it came into your hands, since I know more of the tale than you. You're a fool to bring me this, or else you are more subtle than I thought." He turned and pointed at the lintel of the church door, his fingers spread like claws. "I see that sign you used to summon us and wonder at your joke. I'll provide your hook and taper, and I'll go further. just to spite our old friend Samuel. I'll have it made and sent up by the Artisans' Assembly. The beasts have forges in their pits which put ours to shame. I'll give them that." He turned to the other men. "Excuse me, boys. I must go and place a call." Sam muttered under his breath, but made no move to stop him. They watched as Frank approached a derelict phone booth on the next corner, saw him lift the receiver and spin the dial. Crowther shook his head. "Does that thing even work?" Barnabas gave a short laugh. "It will for Frank." The tall man soon returned, not bothering to conceal a look of surprise and puzzlement. "They won't be bringing it up. You're to go down and fetch it. They've sent up an escort, knowing when you would arrive." He frowned. "Now, who do you figure tipped them off?" "Spies," said Sam. "What did I tell you? They know what you're thinking even before you say the words." He looked up at the sky. "I've seen blazes 3 nights now, moving east to west, and not infernal ones." A thundering rumble came from the pithead, which had been constructed deep in the rubble of the church. "That'll be the taxman," Frank said. "Scatter, boys." Bat-like, the men dispersed into the shadows, as if they were no more than shadows themselves, leaving Crowther alone at the bottom of the brick steps. He waited, steeling himself for the arrival of the old enemy he knew was approaching through the maze of bricks and timbers. Its light came first, an amber flood enhancing the colors of every object it touched. When the beast itself appeared, Crowther was surprised to see it dressed in coveralls and a grimy miner's cap. It stood taller than a tall man, hoofed like a calf, its long, supple fingers tipped with curving claws. But its human face held a look of serenity, at once old and young. "Pigtail Alley," the creature murmured in a voice like the rush of surf meeting sand. "You have kept to your old accommodations." "The rooms are familiar," Crowther replied, "and they happen to be empty." His eyes narrowed. "Who told you I was coming?" "Everyone and no one," the creature replied. "Your arrival was anticipated from the foundation, but we have watched with interest the paths you have chosen. You've upset Samuel. He thinks you have spies at every corner." The creature gave a nod. "Once we were all God's spies, but now we must see to ourselves." "The devils here seem alive and well," said Crowther, "though they didn't look to be particularly busy this morning." "They are as dead as you, though they are slow to realize it. They cluster in obscurity and work what harm they can. Now you will bring light to dark places." "They haven't threatened anything, but I suppose they'll hinder me." "They have learned patience in their long years. First, they will watch and wait." The creature led Crowther into the ruins. They followed a rough, meandering path, which looped and spiraled among the debris, and came at last to a wood and metal framework, the headstock of a mine shaft enclosing a broad platform. A rusty sign hung from a chain. "Danger. Hard hats required beyond this point. Keep hands and arms inside cage." The creature stepped into the tall enclosure, moving back to make room for Crowther to follow. Crowther paused, studying the great wheels of the contraption with a trace of misgiving. "How far down does it go?" "All the way to the bottom," the beast replied. "But the descent will seem timeless to you. Are you afraid of enclosed spaces?" "I prefer the open air," Crowther replied. "The delvings are spacious. Don't be afraid." As Crowther stepped in, the wheels spun, and the wheels within them moved and meshed, humming and clattering. The cage began to descend. It sank slowly at first, then gained speed. Darkness rose about them, dimming the glare of the town above. As the minutes passed, the rattle and groan of the machinery lulled him. He drifted in stillness, encircled by his own history, moving toward an uncertain future. At last, the cage began to slow. It struck the solid bottom of the shaft, and the safety guard rattled up, revealing the tunnel beyond. Small lamps embedded in the walls marked the way with a greasy, smoldering light. The air was chilly, but close and motionless. Deep in the mines of hell, from somewhere beyond the curve of the tunnel, Crowther heard the muffled thud and ring of music. He stepped forward, falling into blackness, and when he awoke, he was once again at the corner of Broad and Stephen Street, and evening shadows were lengthening across the town. In his right hand he clasped the yew rod, its hook and taper beautifully wrought of gleaming iron, ornamented with a tracery of leaves and flowers. In his left hand the old Dietz lantern glowed with an amber flame. The first of the lamps awaited him across the street, and he approached it with resolution. It crowned a tall black pole, resembling a London gaslight. Crowther lit the taper from the flame of his lantern, lifted his rod, and opened the lamp with the hook. The flame passed from taper to wick, and the lamp took light. The glow flared with a surprising brightness, and Crowther found himself almost blinded, until it steadied and diminished. Startled, he watched as images appeared within the glass panes, the outlines of a walled terrace, where a woman and a man were engaged in quiet conversation. He stepped back, then glanced down at his lantern. Not kerosene. What had May put in there? He had not expected this, and he doubted that the sharp-dressed men had foreseen it. But the beast with the human face must have known, and fashioned the taper accordingly. "Give me this," Crowther murmured. "I shall go forward and back. Do you see how the shapes are formed?" No one answered his question, but in the night's secret work, each lamp would reveal the way to the next. They would mark his passing, like bulbs in a strand of Christmas lights, draped along the desolate streets. He moved along the sidewalk, recalling the child May kept hidden away. Nestled among the folds of black drapery, the thing had appeared almost human. But when its eyes had opened, Crowther had seen dark blazes in them, moving from east to west. You have been listening to an audio recording of The Lamplighter by Beau Farr, the first story in Dim and Flaring Lamps, the third book of the Forked Ways. The cover art for this story is by Carrie Hardin. The audio production is by R.J. Williams. The text and audio recording are copyright 2013 by Beau Farr. All rights reserved.